Back in the early noughties, long before streaming took off and Netflix were merely a humble DVD rental service, you had to get your fix of red-hot TV shows either by waiting to see which terrestrial TV channel got the rights, get the box set, or if you were down with the kids, you'd have a cable or satellite service which offered things like HBO. HBO are now, of course, the gold standard for TV drama series and boast a library of pretty much every best ever TV show that's ever been conceived. And the best of them all is a show called The Wire. Created by Baltimore Sun journalist and author David Simon, The Wire set out to turn the traditional cop show genre on its head, and in successfully doing so, would go on to redefine what you could demand of a TV audience. Simon was able to achieve this by being someone bathed in Baltimore culture. Operating as the crime reporter for the Baltimore Sun, he found himself steeped in more of the culture than probably most in a city notoriously nicknamed Bodymore Murderland. As a result, what you have in The Wire is a microscopic analysis of the city in which it's based. So where the hell am I finding a link to Revachol? Well, Baltimore and Revachol are wildly different on the surface, but if you allow yourself to be immersed in the stories these worlds are trying to tell, they have a lot to say on geopolitics, workers' rights, the human spirit in the face of adversity, the long-lasting effects of societal abandonment, the reliance on institutions designed to fail us, and of course the pros and cons of drugs. Lots of drugs. So how do we break this down? Well, The Wire is here to help us with that. Although the show has a brilliantly complicated overarching plot, it does focus each of its 5 seasons into the specific vital organs of Baltimore. They are the police, the docks, the government, the education system, and the press. Disco Elysium and The Wire offer nuanced, often critical perspectives on policing, but they approach the subject through their unique contexts and storytelling mediums. Both go beyond the typical portrayal of police as either purely heroic or corrupt, instead using their settings to explore how policing functions within, and is often undermined by, larger systemic issues. They both present policing as an institution entangled in dysfunction and bureaucracy. However, while The Wire is directly rooted in the real-world American city of Baltimore, Disco Elysium obviously uses a fictional, semi-dystopian setting that exaggerates, but also critiques, real-world policing and bureaucracy. For The Wire, policing is portrayed as a complex, often failing system. Officers are constantly dealing with pressure from political and institutional forces, which means they have to make compromises that rarely benefit public safety. The police are burdened by targets and quotas, which incentivize duking the stats and focusing on minor offences to improve their numbers. It creates a self-perpetuating cycle where the actual needs of the community, like addressing the root causes of crime, get neglected. In Disco Elysium, the Revachol Citizens Militia is a fractured institution with low morale, limited funding, and almost no influence outside of select neighbourhoods. The RCM has pretty much no power in the eyes of the people it aims to serve, and much of its work is, as Harry himself notes, merely symbolic. His investigation has him scrambling to resolve cases with minimal resources, while also trying to deal with his own personal crises. It reflects how policing in this world is a hollow shell of what it might once have represented, now functioning almost as a formality in a society that ceased to expect real accountability or protection from law enforcement. The vehicle in which we see these stories are 2 deeply flawed, often self-destructive police officers, Jimmy McNulty in The Wire and Harry Dubois for Disco Elysium.
So what we conclude from a behavioral analysis of the known forensics is the following. The suspect is likely a white male in his late 20s to late 30s. He likely is not a college graduate, but feels nonetheless superior to those with advanced education.
What? She only wants you to follow instructions. Nothing intellectually stimulating. In this task, a child could do it.
And he is likely employed in a bureaucratic entity, possibly civil service or quasi-public service, from which he feels alienated.
Fuck me. Mac, come here. You've got to hear this. Dick Mullen lost his badge.
What's going on?
Super Cop here lost his badge.
He lost his what now?
His badge. He lost his goddamn fucking badge.
He asks you to please stop saying he lost his badge. Why? Did he find it?
Each character wrestles with their own psychological issues, addictions, and strained relationships with authority, which complicates their ability to serve and protect. McNulty is a talented but extremely volatile detective who frequently clashes with his superiors, undermining his own goals by refusing to follow the rules. His flaws, particularly his drinking and disregard for orders, both hinder and define his approach to solving cases. He's a representative of an officer who's more committed to his own ego and reputation than to his community, highlighting how personal ambitions and flaws can distort the purpose of policing. Disco Elysium goes one further, using Harry's character to delve into the internal psychology of a detective who has all but lost his sense of self and purpose. This personal instability shapes how he navigates the investigation and engages with the citizens of Revachol, bringing a raw vulnerability that exposes his own doubts about the legitimacy and purpose of his role. The journey through amnesia and introspection serves as a critique of the idea that a single individual, or even the institution as a whole, can bring meaningful order to an inherently chaotic and neglected society. The relationship between police and that society is central to both stories, with the narratives exploring the lack of trust and alienation between law enforcement and the people they aim to serve. In The Wire, police are often seen as an occupying force in Baltimore's poorest neighbourhoods. Estranged from the communities they patrol, the us versus them mentality between police and citizens is palpable, fueling tensions and creating a sense of distrust that makes policing less effective and more combative. Police officers are rarely embedded in the community. Instead, they are treated by residents as another gang of sorts, wielding power and sometimes even engaging in unethical tactics to gain the upper hand. Harry's investigation brings him face to face with the worn-down residents of Martinez, a neglected district within Revachol. Here, police presence is sporadic to say the least, often untrustworthy and viewed with huge disdain by the citizens who believe that the RCM has long since abandoned their interests. Interactions with the people in Martinez, who range from workers and labourers to local gang members, highlight this fractured relationship, where the police are seen as irrelevant at best and obstructive at worst. Rather than simply protecting the public, Harry's authority is often questioned and undermined, reflecting the deep-seated scepticism of an institution that seems out of touch with the community's real struggles. Disco Elysium and The Wire offer a window into the lives and struggles of dock workers and their unions, painting these institutions as critical entities that are grappling with economic instability, political corruption, and the sense of abandonment by broader society. In both narratives, dock worker unions become a focal point for examining class struggles and the social ramifications of industrial decline. The unions in both stories serve as a lifeline for dock workers who face job insecurity and harsh economic realities. However, each union is also a complicated institution with its own issues of corruption and compromise. Season 2 of The Wire focuses on the Baltimore dock workers union led by Frank Sobotka. Sobotka is deeply committed to preserving jobs and securing a future for the men working under him. He believes that by strengthening the union's influence, he can combat the incoming forces of globalization and industrial decline that were present in the late 90s and early noughties. Faced with a shrinking number of options, we see that Sobotka has turned to smuggling and dodgy deals for an international crime syndicate, ultimately sacrificing his moral principles to keep his union alive. This decision underscores the desperation of unions fighting against forces of progress and automation, which are inevitably too big for them to control. The Debarders Union of Martinez, led by Everard Clare, is the primary power broker in Revachol's decaying district. The union represents the last vestige of organised stability in Martinaise, and many citizens look to it for protection, employment and even justice. Both The Wire and Disco Elysium suggest that unions, while formed with noble intentions, quickly become tainted by corruption and self-interest. However, this corruption is not shown as a simple betrayal of principles, but more as a survival tactic in hostile environments. Sobotka's involvement in smuggling is a direct consequence of his need for funds to pay off politicians who could revitalise the Baltimore port. His compromises reveal the union's vulnerability, as it's forced to play by the rules of a game designed by politicians and corporate interests that have little regard for the lives of the dock workers. Everard Clare is arguably the less well-intentioned of the two, using the union to enrich himself and consolidate his power. He wields influence through coercion, making deals with Harry and manipulating the town's economy to his benefit. Everard's moral flexibility and ruthless pragmatism allow the union to thrive in Revachol, but this also means that the union operates more like a mafia than a traditional workers' organisation. Both stories emphasise the decline of the dockworker industry as emblematic of a larger societal decay, with unions symbolising a last stand against the forces of economic collapse. In The Wire, the decline of the Baltimore docks reflects the broader industrial decline in America. Sobotka's union, once a source of pride and stability for its members, is now struggling to stay afloat. The characters in the dockworker storyline represent the anger and disillusionment of the working class, caught in the tidal wave of globalisation, which has devalued blue-collar labour and hollowed out local economies. In Disco Elysium, the Martinaise Union symbolises the last holdout of organisation and community in Revachol. The union's prominence reflects how working-class institutions can serve as a source of identity and pride, even in those decaying societies. Dock workers in both works embody the struggles of the working class, representing people who have been left behind by political and economic systems that prioritise profits over people. The dock workers in The Wire face the erosion of job security and a government that no longer invests in their livelihoods. The show portrays them as deeply proud blue-collar individuals who are nonetheless frustrated by the realisation that their skills and labour are no longer valued. This disenfranchisement becomes the catalyst for a union's descent into criminality, reflecting how neglect and desperation can push workers towards illicit means of survival. Dock workers and other labourers in Martinaise similarly feel abandoned, especially in the face of the coalition government's neglect. The union represents the last hope for many in Martinaise, particularly for those who see no future outside of the city's decaying infrastructure. Dock workers become representative of a society in stagnation, clinging to the union not only for material support, but also as a source of meaning and purpose. In both cases, the dock workers are the underclass, struggling against the systems that have disregarded their existence. Both The Wire and Disco Elysium use the dock workers and the unions to explore the ideological tensions that arise from economic desperation, highlighting how people turn to different ideologies when traditional means of survival and justice fail. The Wire doesn't explicitly align the dock workers with a particular ideology, but their actions suggest a frustration with both the capitalist system that has abandoned them and the corrupt local government. Sobotka and his union may not explicitly endorse any political ideology, but their story reflects a working class attitude that borders on class resentment. The resentment fuels Sobotka's anger, but his inability to effect real change reflects the limited power of unions in an increasingly neoliberal economy. In both The Wire and Disco Elysium, these dock workers serve as powerful symbols of the working class's fight for survival within these exploitative systems. Each narrative examines the desperation and compromises the unions have to make to preserve their power. Yet where The Wire sees the union struggles as ultimately tragic and futile, Disco Elysium suggests that unions might still have a role, however compromised, as a form of resistance against societal collapse. Through these stories, both works paint a sobering picture of the limitations of unions in the face of overwhelming socio-economic forces, revealing how even the most well-intentioned institutions are shaped and often corrupted by the world they inhabit. Through their nuanced analysis of political institutions and figures, both works delve into how political systems often fail their constituents, how power is consolidated by a select few, and how ordinary people navigate or are crushed by these systems. Bureaucracy is painted as a source of inertia, where procedures often hinder meaningful change. Government institutions in each work become bogged down by rules, red tape, and personal interests that obstruct effective action. In The Wire, this is evident across nearly every level of Baltimore's institutions, from police departments to City Hall. The police are bound by quotas and political pressures, pushing them to prioritise appearances over real justice. For instance, police departments manipulate stats to make it appear as if crime is decreasing, even if this means avoiding actual investigation of serious issues. City officials like Mayor Carcetti are also constrained by political ambitions, often choosing the appearance of reform over substantial improvements. This bureaucratic stagnation illustrates how institutions intended to serve and protect are so entangled in self-preservation that they lose sight of their public mission. Revershol's government, controlled by a coalition of foreign powers, is similarly mired in inefficiency. The coalition's bureaucratic presence is distant and indifferent, leaving Revershol's people feeling abandoned. When Harry is attempting to solve his murder case, he's hampered by procedural inefficiencies and often left to work alone due to limited resources and unclear authority. The Revershol Citizens Militia, essentially a holiday institution with little real power, reflects a disinterest of the coalition government. In The Wire, politicians like Mayor Royce and Tommy Carcetti aren't portrayed as evil, but their actions reveal how the political game limits moral choices. Carcetti, for example, starts with idealistic intentions to reform Baltimore but gradually succumbs to the demands of political survival. He compromises his principles to secure re-election, choosing policies that maintain his image rather than benefit Baltimore's underserved communities. In Disco Elysium, figures like Everett Clare and the coalition's leadership embody similar moral ambiguity. Everett manipulates his workers and dabbles in criminal activities to secure his power, claiming that his ends justify the means. He rationalises his morally questionable actions as necessary for protecting Martinez from the coalition's neglect, positioning himself as a populist figure who will do what it takes for his people. The coalition, meanwhile, remains a faceless entity, indifferent to the people of Revershol. The residents of Baltimore's poorer neighbourhoods, especially those in West Baltimore, are largely ignored by political leaders. Citizens lack any real voice in the political process as they're caught in a cycle of poverty, crime, and institutional neglect. Education, public housing, and economic opportunities are scarce, leaving them disenfranchised and forced to rely on illicit means of survival. This structural failure shows how politics often fails to address the root causes of poverty and crime, leading to a vicious cycle where most vulnerable are left behind. Similarly, Disco Elysium's Martinez district is a microcosm of political neglect. Revershol, once a revolutionary hub, is now a ghost of its former self, stripped of autonomy and under coalition rule. Martinez's citizens are isolated, abandoned by the coalition, and left to create their own makeshift governance through the likes of Everett Clare. The residents live in a state of stagnation where survival is the primary concern, and aspirations for a better life are met with cynicism. And we can't talk politics without a good old dose of corruption, right? In The Wire, corruption is rampant among both police and political figures, driven by a system that rewards manipulation and self-interest over public service. Officers engage in juking the stats to meet crime reduction targets, and politicians prioritise campaign promises that will secure votes rather than substantive reforms. They aren't driven by inherent immorality, but by a survival instinct within an unsustainable system that punishes those who don't play by its rules. Corruption becomes a coping mechanism for those stuck in an institution that leaves little room for ethical choices. The coalition government's bureaucratic indifferences is itself a form of corruption, showing a system that doesn't care about the welfare of Revershol's people. Here, corruption isn't simply a vice, but a response to a system that's abandoned the very people it's supposed to serve. Both works take on the task of critiquing ideological extremes too. They show ideologies, whether capitalist, socialist or revolutionary, often fail when confronted with the messy reality of human societies. In The Wire, the characters don't adhere to any single ideology. Instead, they're pragmatic actors adapting to circumstances. While the series shows the failures of capitalism, it also highlights how idealistic reforms fail when leaders prioritise optics over substance. The show remains agnostic about ideology, implying that real change requires addressing complex structural issues rather than adhering to simplistic solutions. Disco Elysium makes ideology a central aspect of its narrative, however, with Harry able to explore communism, moralism, ultra-liberalism, and fascism. Each of those ideologies offers insights but also limitations, and the game never endorses any one belief system. Instead, Disco Elysium critiques these ideologies by showing how they can be manipulated or fail to deliver on their promises in the context of Revishol's struggles. The game allows players to experiment with these ideologies and moral choices, yet ultimately the broader structures of oppression and neglect remain untouched. The ambiguity reflects the reality that individual actions can only go so far in addressing systemic issues, leaving the player with a sense of unresolved tension and a reminder that real change is rarely straightforward. Disco Elysium and The Wire each offer stark, poignant analysis of how these systemic failures impact the lives of children, revealing how the weight of societal neglect, poverty and violence shapes the youngest and most vulnerable members of our society. Both works use the experience of children to illustrate the tragic generational effects of these issues, painting a picture of childhood that is far from idyllic. They are depicted in both worlds as early witnesses to violence, poverty and despair, with little in the way of protection or guidance from the adults. This exposure to the harsh realities of their environments often forces children to grow up quickly, robbing them of the carefree experiences typically associated with childhood. In The Wire, children in West Baltimore such as Michael, Dookie, Randy and Namond are thrust into the world of drug dealing, gang violence and survival from a young age. Each of these characters navigates a neighbourhood defined by territorial drug wars and minimal support systems. These children face constant exposure to trauma, both physical and emotional, which shapes their worldviews and their futures. For example, Michael turns to the drug trade not out of choice, but as a perceived necessity to protect himself and his younger brother in a world that offers very few alternatives. Disco Elysium's approach is slightly different, but similarly uses children's interactions with the world around them to reveal the extent of societal decay. Kuno and Kuno S, who are found harassing others in Martinez, have adopted hardened, nihilistic attitudes. They exhibit aggressive and disturbing behaviour that reflects a learned indifference to suffering. Kuno's brash and violent tendencies reveal a sense of resignation, a child's adaptation to a world that feels indifferent to his well-being. Season 4 of The Wire focuses on the Baltimore school system, exposing the neglect, lack of funding, and inadequate support facing inner-city schools. Teachers struggle to manage classrooms filled with students dealing with trauma, behavioural issues, and academic setbacks. Children like Dookie, for example, who is bright and sensitive, have little chance to break out of the cycle of poverty despite their intelligence. The system's inability to provide a quality education or meaningful support leaves children without the skills or hope necessary to escape their circumstances, pushing many towards a crime as the only viable path. While Disco doesn't exactly show schools or a formal education system, the children of Martinez clearly lack access to the opportunities or stability that might have given them a brighter future. Revachol, with its political unrest and economic decay, has become a place where even basic social services are rare or non-existent. Kuno and his peers seem to have no concept of formal education or future aspirations, indicative of a society that has failed its young. Their lack of guidance and exposure to role models leaves them in a sort of suspended childhood, where opportunities are so few that there's little motivation to think beyond the immediate present. The lack of parental figures profoundly impacts the lives of children in both of these works. Due to the overwhelming societal and economic pressures, parents in these worlds are often unable to provide the necessary guidance and support, leading children to look elsewhere for structure or validation. In The Wire, many of the children come from broken homes or have parents who are absent, struggling with addiction, or are otherwise incapable of providing stability. Michael's mother is addicted to drugs, which leaves him as the de facto head of the household, looking after his younger brother and making sacrifices that no child should have to make. Randy, in contrast, is raised by a foster mother who cares deeply for him, but even her dedication can't protect him from the systemic dangers around him. The lack of parental support or positive role models pushes many of these children into the streets, where gangs and criminal activities fill the void left by absent or ineffective parents. We see similar themes of parental neglect through Kuno and his dad. He's frequently found unsupervised, engaging in harmful behaviours that seem to reflect an internalised neglect. His disregard for authority figures, disdain for adults, and erratic behaviour suggest a child who has learned not to expect protection or guidance from anyone. His antagonistic and defensive attitude hints at what he experiences in his home environment, which seems to offer him no support or love, forcing him to act out and fend for himself in whatever way he can. The breakdown of the family unit and absence of caring adults contribute to an environment where children are left to cope on their own, often in damaging ways. The children in both of these worlds are shown to be victims of the cycles of trauma that trap them in poverty, mental health issues and criminal activity. These cycles are self-perpetuating, as children who lack resources and positive role models are likely to fall into the same patterns as the adults around them. The Wire meticulously portrays how generational poverty, violence and trauma are passed down, affecting children's futures. Dookie, for example, is bright and willing to learn, but is hindered by an unstable home life and lack of support. As he gets older, despite his initial promise, he succumbs to the same hopeless path as those before him, joining the streets and eventually turning to drugs. The inability of the community to break this cycle highlights the devastating impact of poverty on young people, as they are forced to make choices that lead them into the same struggles as the adults around them. In Disco, the generational trauma is more subtle but equally poignant. The children of Martinez inherit the scars of Revachol's failed revolution and economic devastation, raised in an environment that has long since lost hope for change. Kuno's behaviour and language suggest a child who has internalised the cynicism and anger of his environment, embodying the nihilistic outlook that mirrors the despair of the adults around him. This cycle of trauma creates a bleak outlook for his future, as he lacks the support or resources to envision a life beyond survival in Martinez's harsh environments. Despite these harsh portrayals, both The Wire and Disco Elysium do hint at the resilience of children. Although they offer no easy answers or happy endings, there are glimpses of hope, even if it's often tinged with ambiguity or cut short by circumstances beyond the character's control. In The Wire, we see Naaman does have a chance to break the cycle, as he is taken in by Bunny Colvin, a former police major, who sees the potential for a different future. This gesture, though, is the exception rather than the rule, suggesting that without significant intervention, children will likely continue down the same paths as the generations before them. Disco Elysium offers a similar story of hope with Kuno. If Harry finds himself down the right path, he has the option to insist on Kuno being brought into the protective custody of the RCM, ultimately rescuing him from the endless cycle of misery he is currently cemented in. This moment suggests that even in a world as bleak as Revachol, small gestures can potentially shift a child's outlook or plant a seed of change. However, like The Wire, this hope is understated and rare, implying that genuine change for children in such environments requires far more than the efforts of a single well-meaning individual. The presence of the press, or the concept of news reporting and journalism, is a little harder to find in Disco Elysium, but reading between the lines you can make some comparisons to how both works view the responsibility of media as a whole. They both critique the media's role as society's supposed watchdog. However, they also highlight how often journalism falls short of this ideal, largely due to the influence of political and economic pressures that warp media coverage away from exposing the issues. In The Wire, the 5th season specifically tackles the Baltimore Sun newsroom, exposing the ethical conflicts that arise within a media organisation. The Sun's staff members want to report on the dire conditions affecting Baltimore's communities, such as poverty, crime and institutional neglect, but face pushback from editors and corporate leadership focused more on awards, circulation numbers and profits. Journalists like Gus Haynes, an editor at The Sun, represent the idea of responsible journalism, yet even he struggles to produce impactful stories amidst budget cuts, editorial interference, and the prioritisation of sensationalism. Disco Elysium, on the other hand, doesn't have a traditional newsroom or reporting infrastructure within its world, but it explores how information and narrative shape society's perception of truth. The game portrays Revachol as a city filled with misinformation, rumours and propaganda, with multiple political factions attempting to control the flow of information. Harry, as a detective, somewhat operates like a journalist, tasked with uncovering facts amidst an environment where ideologies and misinformation distort reality. The portrayal of media in Disco Elysium is more abstract and philosophical, suggesting that truth itself can be slippery and manipulated depending on who holds power and whose narrative prevails. In The Wire, we see much of the media through the eyes of Scott Templeton, a journalist at The Sun who fabricates stories and quotes to gain attention and acclaim. His actions highlight how individual ambition and the desire for recognition can lead journalists to compromise their own integrity. Templeton's fabrications go largely unchallenged within the paper, as his sensational stories align with The Sun's desire for gripping headlines. The critique is deeply cynical, suggesting that the pursuit of awards or fame can corrupt the very institution that should be most dedicated to truth. In Disco Elysium, the notion of media corruption is more abstract, but the game hints at how information in Revachol is deeply compromised by competing ideological agendas. Throughout the game, Harry encounters individuals who each provide a different truth about the world, often distorted by their own ideological beliefs. In their respective explorations of media and journalism, The Wire and Disco Elysium share a similar skepticism about the media's effectiveness in a world plagued by political agendas and public distrust. The Wire provides a more grounded, realistic portrayal of how journalistic integrity is often compromised by the pressures of profit and sensationalism, leading to public disengagement. So this tale of two cities, one real, one imagined, both shaped by forces that perpetuate cycles of struggle, compromise and disillusionment. Through these worlds we see the institutions like the police, government, unions and media, not necessarily as always sources of hope or progress, but as systems that, well, perhaps created to serve the public, often fall short and even contribute to the despair around them. The Wire presents Baltimore as a city bogged down by bureaucracy, political self-interest and cycles of poverty, while Disco Elysium shows Revachol to be a place haunted by ideological fractures and abandoned by governing powers. The characters within these worlds, like the detectives, the dock workers, or the morally ambiguous union leaders and weary citizens, are all caught in webs of corruption, economic stagnation and generational trauma. They're all bound together by systems larger than themselves, with brief fragile moments of resilience offering only the faintest hope. Both works explore how even children are impacted by these cycles, revealing how institutional failure seeps into every layer of life and especially into those most vulnerable to its effects. In the end, The Wire and Disco Elysium share a view of systemic failure that doesn't offer easy answers or happy endings. By inviting us to navigate their flawed worlds, these stories urge us to confront difficult questions about the role of institutions, the price of survival, and whether genuine change can ever be achieved within systems that seem designed to resist it. Baltimore and Revachol may be a tale of two completely different cities, but both remind us that sometimes our deepest struggles are tragically universal.